Our podcast is supported by Adobe and the Adobe Creative Cloud, the world's best creative app and services, so you can make almost anything you can imagine wherever you're inspired. We use Adobe to help make this podcast using Audition, InDesign, and more. So join the creative community with the Adobe Creative Cloud, and let's make something better, unlocking your world of creativity. Tap into your most original thinking, organize your ideas, and create the opportunities to launch your creative work. Unlocking your world of creativity with best-selling author and brand innovator, Mark Stinson.
Well, welcome back, friends, to our podcast, Unlocking Your World of Creativity. This is our 250th episode. Wow, it's been quite a ride. And it made me want to go back to the beginning to kind of relive and reissue the roots of this series. It all began in the summer of 2019. My good friend G. Mark Phillips and I were talking about an interview series for his podcast at that time, Enhancing the Human Experience, where we would talk to successful people from around the globe and find out how they get inspired and where ideas come from and how they apply creativity in their business and personal lives. And I want to reissue the first episode where we really brought together two creative people from opposite ends of the world, really. Bob Baurys of 83 Bar and Cristián Saracco of Allegro 234. So enjoy this episode. If you've heard it before, I hope you get some new ideas from it. If you weren't with us at the very beginning, I hope you find this to be a real inspiration to you for your creativity. Specifically in this episode, you'll discover how to grow your business through the power of branding, the value of personalizing your product or service when making business decisions. You'll learn how to successfully sell your ideas to clients. And then you'll hear Bob talk about speed, and speed actually reducing risk at every level. So enjoy this interview with Bob and Cristián. And if you find it helpful, I hope you'll rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast going forward. Thanks so much.
Coming to you from Boise, Idaho, the fastest growing city in the U.S. and recognized as one of the most creative and vibrant cities to live in. This is A World of Creativity, a series of unique interviews with successful people from around the globe, how they get inspired, where their ideas come from, and how they apply creativity in their business and personal lives. Now, here's your host, Mark Stinson and Mark Phillips.
When we talk about a world of creativity, we've got a great example of it today. We've got Bob in Austin, Texas, and we've got Cristián in Madrid, Spain. Both of these guys are really idea machines in my mind. I've known Bob for nearly 5 years, had a chance to partner up with him and his company. We even published a book last month together called Patient Activation. Bob is a founder and CEO of a company called 83 Bar, but that only begins to describe his business and serial entrepreneurship. And we're going to get into a lot of this, but Bob has an idea a minute for a business.
I love it.
And he's one to keep up with. I've known Cristián, became acquainted with him probably since 2008. He was a board member of the Asia Brand Congress out of Mumbai, India. I had a chance to go to Mumbai and speak to this branding conference. And again, I have a sense that Cristián dreams in brands. He is a very prolific writer, many articles, many points of view. He's got some great newsletters. I've always admired Cristián's brand leadership in this regard. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you.
It's great to talk to you. Tell us a little bit about what's going on with 83 Bar these days and what you're working on.
The 83 Bars, the idea was about 5 years ago that there's an interesting way and a systematic way to get patients to not only learn about new things, but also take action and begin to manage their own healthcare. And through the course of the last 5 years, with some of your help, actually, as we've developed a pretty programmatic, systematic way to make sure that patients are empowered, that once they learn about something, they can actually, in a predictable manner, begin to take action and better their own health. And it's gone fairly well. We got several significantly large pharma and medical device companies engaging us now. and a fair amount of new patients going on therapy that probably wouldn't have found out about it. And if they found out about it, wouldn't know how to even begin to start the process. As consumers become much more the drivers of their own healthcare in the United States, I think it becomes really important that if you're a consumer, you have to know how to be a consumer. It's not an innate thing in a very complicated industry. That's a mission we think about every morning when we wake up.
Well, that's fantastic. And Cristian, you're a founder of a consulting group called Allegro 234, but you also have another variety of interests. But I'm curious how things are developing right now for you at Allegro 234.
Yeah, hello, Mark and Bob. I could say that things are going well in Allegro 234. We began something like 16 years ago here in Spain. I'm foreigner, so I began from scratch. And with the idea of not talking about branding as something which is completely ununderstandable by our clients. So we began to talk in terms of business about branding, telling them or explaining them how they can grow through their brands. And we began doing that. We developed beautiful cases, and right now we are also developing beautiful cases where we are not only talking about branding, but also about a new way of understanding the customer journey, the experience they are living. And in that sense, we are also developing new products and services with banks or also with a business school here in Spain. So we are doing well, I would say.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I think one of the things that you both have in common that I wanted to explore a little bit is that what you said, Cristian, that you started this business from scratch. The business itself was an idea. And to turn that idea into a seed of a business, and then you have to nurture it and water it, tend to it and grow it and keep the mission and keep the vision. I'm curious to hear from both of you how you keep the idea in focus over the years and over the changes in the business climate.
I could say that we don't only nurture our idea, but we discovered that although we are maintaining a certain purpose, our concepts of how we serve our clients are evolving. It's not only a question of looking for new products and services, but also we are evolving in the way we are serving traditional products and redefining those services, but actually maintaining their souls. I really don't know if I'm extremely clear with that. But the idea is we had an idea was to talk about branding under a business point of view. We maintain that with a clear purpose because when we are talking about business, for example, we are talking about the triple bottom line. So we are considering several issues in addition to profits, but the concepts behind the scene, I would say that are clearly evolving and changing. I don't know if every day, but certainly twice or three times per year.
Right. Yeah. And Bob, what about you? From idea to a real company and making it an enterprise, how do you stay focused on the big idea?
I think what I found works for me personally is that I just personalize the idea. When we get into a market, whether it's this or some of my previous companies, in my brain, I try to figure out exactly who that person or persons we're going to be helping are and create that persona in my brain. So to the point where I feel like I'm obligated and all decisions and obligated to make it work for them. So in the case of what we're doing now at 83 Bar, I think about several of my relatives who needed access to medical devices or medication and didn't really know where to turn, didn't have, before I intervened, they didn't really have anybody in the medical business that they knew, and how lost and out of the mainstream they felt. And I think about them almost every decision we make with the company because I figure that if you focus on the core constituency, the idea burns deep and passionate because you're actually helping in your mind, you're actually helping an individual. In reality, if you do that for that individual in your mind, it's really translating to helping many people that are in that same situation. So that tends to keep it focused. It certainly worked for me in this business and has worked in previous businesses that I had, since like fibromyalgia and fatigue centers. That was all focused on 4 or 5 of the first patients we saw. And really every decision was based on trying to focus back on realizing what they were going through and trying to help them get through it.
So this idea of really making it personal so that you can envision the individual, the person that you're trying to serve.
Right. And then so it becomes personal on a level of building the business to a critical mass. So you're getting to a level where you can actually help take care of that person in your brain. And then what it becomes after that is you take that person and start multiplying them. And that's how you start to think about, how do I scale? How do I help many of these type of people? And that becomes the next level of scale. And then obviously the last level of scale is, how do I help thousands of these people? So if you think about it in magnitudes, it's single and then tens to hundreds, and then how do I help thousands? And if you keep that focused, it changes the idea a little bit, because obviously as you scale up to help thousands and thousands of people, it has to become much more regimented, much more systematic and predictable. Rather, it has to become science rather than art. But if you work on the art at the small level, the science becomes an art by itself.
Yeah. And what about translating that passion or that personalization, to a team, to a staff, to a company? Let's talk about that kind of scaling. Is it finding the right people? Is it instilling that mission into them once they've joined the organization? Maybe there's a bit of a chicken and the egg there, but how do you get everyone to buy into that idea?
It's interesting because I think all businesses go through a metamorphosis and a process that, in the beginning, when you start a company, you're looking for a specific type of person that can focus on a goal without a lot of roles and without a lot of constraints. And so I always say this, and it's probably the worst part of running businesses by far. It's the worst part for me. And that is that the people who can get you through the first part are oftentimes not the people who can get you through the second part, because they're two different people. And quite frankly, I'm limited even in the second part. When you're building one of these businesses that has a personal stake, and you're trying to get something done that's big and hasn't been done before, or has been done very poorly before, the early employees you need are people who can think independently, make calculated risks, not be afraid to take chances in situations, and also focus on not what's been done before, but what can be done. And so at the end of as you're coming through that development period, you're breaking all the rules and you're developing new paths. It's like somebody who has a heart attack. Oftentimes you get arteries will start to rebuild around the heart, and blood flow pathways will start to rebuild. That's what you have to do in the beginning of a business. You have to just make sure that you're not just repeating what somebody else did, but you're oftentimes fixing what they did or building new pathways to do what they did. Now, as you come through the initial startup, and that startup can range anywhere from when you hit 5, 10, 15, $20 million worth of revenue, depending on the business, then you get to a point where it needs to start to scale and become predictable. And that's when you have to figure out, there's a small minority of people can transfer from that unstructured, free thinking environment to the environment that comes next, which requires structured thinking and predictability and the ability to replicate systems. And so that's always the trick. I think, to me, there's 2 parts to these businesses to keep an idea alive. The first part is you need the people who can create it and nurture it and grow it to a teenager. And then the second team is really the people who could take the 20-year-old and mature it into an adult. And that's the way I look at keeping businesses alive. They're not necessarily the same people, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. 2 different kinds of thinking and approach. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Now, Cristián, you founded the company with kind of a small group of senior consultants. Tell us a little bit about how you're organized. And again, the question being, how do you keep the central idea in focus as you grow and add people and add clients?
When we began, actually, we established, I would say, to make it simple, a 2-step process to have people on board. The first one was, and is actually, to know the person, and not their capabilities, and to see if we can work, stay, and drink a beer with that person. And we spend a lot of time in that, talking and looking for if we personally can be connected. And the second step, obviously, is to see if they have the capabilities and the kind of professional level we are expecting from that person. And actually, that approach is at least working with us. I would say that 80% of our little team, because as you said, we are a little professional senior staff. 80% of it, we are working together during the last, in average, during the last 12 years. So it's a very stable team, and actually we are friends. And that's the good reason that why we are in the same frequency when we are talking and when we are working together, and when we try to tell other people what our culture is, how we manage the projects and all that stuff. We are in the same line, and so that's good.
That's very helpful. So I'd like to turn to the idea generation process for a second and thinking about where ideas come from. And we often have this phrase, the idea came to me, as if I was a magnet and the idea found me. But I know, Cristián, you include sort of anthropology as a skill or a capability in your group, that where you're not waiting for the idea to come to you, you're going out to find ideas. How do you balance those two? Do ideas come to you, or do you have to go out and find the idea?
I think we are using both ways. Actually, there are in certain moments needs for inspiration in all this process, and we have to go and look for new ideas. And what is interesting on that is that sometimes we go to look for those ideas in history and art, and we try to discover what was happening hundreds of years ago, and we discover that we can evolve those concepts and translate into new ideas, and there it begins a kind of ideation process, which is good. So most of the time we go to look for ideas. Ideas come by intuition. Yeah, they could come by, but I would say that most of the time we are looking for and not waiting that the ideas come like something. They are in the air.
Bob, what about you? How does it work for you?
I think it comes by compression, and compression meaning that you go to a client, or you're underneath significant pressure to something's not working. And I always find that the best ideas, the accumulation of the stuff that really moves the needle, always happens because of a significant urgent need. Whether we're trying to get a client and we're trying to figure out how to be differentiated, or we're trying to do something that's really struggling with the client. If you go to your normal set of toolbox and your normal toolbox is not working, that's your default brain position, right? So once you run through all the tools and none of the tools work, it creates another spark that we have to go and figure out, okay, how am I going to get this done? Or the other thing, in terms of doing startups my whole life, there's always that whole moment where the business, I think every one of these startup businesses has 2 or 3 life or death moments where you're either going to make it or you're not going to make it. Yeah, and I find those to be really compelling moments for you to be able to develop concepts and ideas. So I always thought about it as ideas as a compression type thing. When you run out of the toolbox or you're at a life or death moment, the normal playbook's not going to work. And then all of a sudden, things that you wouldn't have normally thought of become viable. That's when you start to reach. And that's when you
So
start.
this idea that you're looking for a solution, something's got to fix this problem. I like the toolbox analogy.
Yeah, and I can certainly relate to that. When the pressure, are you saying that when the pressure is on, you dig deeper, Bob, or you find a new path to find a new solution? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. And I think it's even a little bit more than that. I think you're forced to, right? As we go through our normal lives, our normal business lives, or any part of our life, things become complacent and they become easy. And so when you're not, your brain gets stretched when it needs to be stretched. And when you're up against the wall and you need to make something happen, and or somebody has a problem and you're really trying to solve it, but nothing else normal solves it, that's when the constraints come off. And when the constraints come off, when everything around you is not working and everything in your recall is not working, well, then you're removed to those boundaries. And when those boundaries leave your brain, there's all kinds of interesting stuff that starts to happen. When you start asking about, when the what ifs start to become the desperation what ifs, there's a lot of really interesting genius type stuff that's found in those desperation what ifs.
That's and like you said, some of it might come intuitively, but let's talk about the tools for a second. Do you have a go-to thinking method, or I draw 9 boxes on a piece of paper, or I draw a triangle and here's the 3 points? Even if you don't do it physically, do you have a mental,
like a process
that you feel like is a problem-solving creative tool?
Yeah. I tend to use a 3x3 grid. If what I'll do is I'll take a pen and paper and just draw out a 3x3 grid, and the upper left-hand point will be the problem. Above the grid will be the problem. And then I typically tend to think in threes. And so if you think about on the left-hand side, I'll put down what I think might work. The right-hand side, the middle column, like a tic-tac-toe board, the middle column would be why it would work. And then the right side of the column the outside part of the tic-tac-toe board is be why it wouldn't work. And that's a scoring system that I use for myself. And part of it is because when the boundaries and the restraints are off, you start to, I'm sure this sort of happens to everybody, but the amount of idea flow starts to become significant. Like it feels like you can't think of anything to do, and then all of a sudden it becomes significant. And when it becomes significant, you want to get the number 2, number 1, number 2, and number 3 out of your head, and then start to work through the flow. And I often find that the solution comes from those first 3 that I write down, and it's usually a hybrid of those 3. And it usually comes from figuring out why it will work and why it won't work, and working those combinations together. It's just something that I've done for a long time. I'm sure everybody else has a different pattern or methodology to do it, but that has worked fairly well for me.
Yeah. Cristián, do you have a go-to method or tool?
Yeah, I would say that we have some sort of methodological framework or something like that. The first step is we try to establish certain objectives and goals to be achieved, and see if we can create with those goals what we call a creative tension. Is to create enough tension to move our brains to generate a new idea, but not too much tension to block people and generate a sort of frustration. Having those goals in mind, we follow what we call the ABCDE process. A from anticipation, where we look for trends and what is happening in different industries, sectors, and whatever, to understand what is going on. And then we began to the B, which is blending ideas. And in that way, we use kiddish processes as making collage or playing with Legos and building blocks to try to convert our concepts into physical ideas. And then we began with the C, which is create different concepts. And we work with those concepts till the moment we say we are going to follow this path, and we begin to design this new brand idea. And then come the E, which is execution. And we execute what we were thinking and used to make a beautiful prototype of our thoughts.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, these are great. And I ask about these tools because, and I'm sure you both have heard this before, but people might say to you, "Oh, you're so creative," or you've got so many good ideas, or you must be very, different than me because I'm not that creative. But it's interesting, Cristián, this ABCDE, yes, it might come intuitive to you, but couldn't anybody look at this and improve their own creativity? And maybe this is the basis of my question. Can one become more creative? How can one develop their creative muscle? Cristián, maybe you.
I think you can develop certain brain muscles to be more creative. Creativity is not a question of inspiration, it's a question of working. It's obvious that you need certain inspiration in certain moments, but I think you have to work on that. And that's why before this A, B, C, D, E, we establish certain goals. Because if you are not extremely creative and you establish high demand of creativeness in your goal, at the end of the day, you are going to be extremely frustrated. So I think that the first step, and before getting into this A, B, C, D, E, is to establish a goal that you see that you can achieve in terms of creativity. And sometimes to do that with certain clients, and specifically when we are working with, I would say, hard-minded people, not soft-minded people, with that people, we used to split their needs in little chapters. So we work with them in little evolutions and not in the telling them that they don't need to create the new iPad. They have to look for a very simple solution. And after that solution, we look for another, and they began to work. And actually, in certain cases, they arrived to beautiful solutions without feeling the restraints or that they are not enough creative or something like that, which I think everybody could be as creative as they want. So it's a question of effort and work and patience.
Bob, how do you see it? How can people improve their creative capability?
I value Christian's very systematic approach to it. I think it probably works very well. In an unsystematic approach that's on a day-to-day of as a business operator, I think you just have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Riding on the theme of compression beforehand, the idea is that compression really is the most uncomfortable position you could be in. It's typically, like we discussed, a life or death situation with the business, or stuff's not working and you can't get it to work and you're out of ideas. That sense of being uncomfortable is not very pleasant the first time or the 10th time or even the 100th time. But if you can get your brain into being very comfortable being uncomfortable, it tends to feel like it enables your brain to have much more elasticity in your thinking. And I've gotten to a point, I think, in my life where I'm okay being uncomfortable, and that seems to help a lot. So when people say I generate a lot of ideas, I think it's just because I don't typically fall into a zone of being very comfortable for very long periods of time very easily anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, Bob. I know that the brain has the capacity to produce infinite ideas, and until you put it in a corner and say, get to work, it sometimes just gets a little bit lackadaisical, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's just a day-to-day, right? Your day-to-day life, it's fight or flight, right? We're genetically pre-programmed for fight or flight. It's really hard to keep yourself on that level of awareness. And the only time you're really that aware is when you're really that uncomfortable with what's going on in your life or what's going on around you. And so if you could trick your brain into being that uncomfortable, sometimes it certainly treats itself to, you get some of your, I think what happens more than anything is when you're uncomfortable, you get your native intuition becomes much stronger. Because if you genetically, we're pre-programmed to figure out a situation so you don't get eaten or by animals or you survive. So if you're uncomfortable, I think that brain gets to that, first of all, that first reaction, native instinct, your gut instinct faster, and thin splice is very much quicker.
And that's a good point.
That's great. And then, Cristián, both of you have mentioned clients as an end customer, so to speak. So you've come up with the idea. You've gone through your 3 columns by 3. Bob, Cristián, you've gone through your ABCD, but now you have to sell the idea to the client. It seems so obvious to you, I'm sure. The creative process you've been through, It's like, hey, this is it. This is the solution. It's so obvious. But not everyone might see it as quickly as we did. Cristián, how do you sell an idea? But how do you then communicate this and instill the same kind of excitement and enthusiasm you might have for the idea into those that are ultimately going to pay for it, fund it, and execute it?
I would say that it depends. This is a very consultant answer. It depends of the kind of client. What we try to see if the way they behave are inductive or deductive. And depending on that, we take the decision of how we are going to tell this new idea. If the person is very deductive, we make a beautiful story and we begin once upon a time and we begin to build a story with them till we arrive to the idea and they say, oh, that's great. If they are very inductive, we begin with the idea itself. We say, we have this idea. And then we give the reasons and the rationale behind the idea and how we arrive to that. Anyway, in both cases, and to assure a certain level of success, in our specific case, we used to build those ideas together with our clients. So when we arrive to a big idea, it's not an idea coming from a black box. It's coming very obvious for them because they were working with us in the whole process.
I see what you're saying. So you've been bringing them along little by little as you go.
Yeah, and we work with them and we sit during hours discussing each part and creating with them. I very much agree with Bob when he say people has to feel uncomfortable because that when we are uncomfortable, we used to use our intuition, and actually our intuition at the end of the day is a rational non-executive process of our brain. We are connecting different ideas to produce things. So if you go step by step with your client creating those new ideas and using their intuition in addition to all the information you can gather to solve the problem you have between hands, it used to work very well. And then we decide if we are going to tell a beautiful story or we are going to go directly to the results and then give a rationale.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Bob, what's your approach? How do you get clients on board with these ideas?
I think the first thing is you have to have the right client, right? So if you're going to test an idea, you have to, everybody has early adopters and everybody has people who are, they want to make sure that everything's correct and right before they do anything. And what I try to do is I try to work with the early adopters as much as possible because they're risk takers. Even in the corporate environment, there's usually one or two or three people you could work with that will take a risk. The second thing is you try to build it. We always take these ideas and we try to think of ourselves in their shoes and then try to present it so that they show benefit. I think sometimes you can show benefit to the business, but there's really two things you need to be thinking about. You have to be showing the person, the sponsor you're trying to pick up the idea, that you're thinking about not only their business and how you can make their business work better, but you also have to be thinking about how you're going to help their career. It tends to make the situation work a lot better when that person, the sponsor, is thinking of you as this, my partner, this person who's coming to me with this idea is thinking in a way that can help me both today and tomorrow, and he's working on my behalf. So what that does psychologically, I think, is it co-ops them into a co-ownership of the idea really quickly. And you can always see these ideas get traction. You're pitching it and you're showing them why it works for their business. You're showing them how they would benefit from it ultimately. And at some point, you'll see them latch on and you'll see them start to take the ownership. And at that point, you can feel the momentum flip. And when that momentum flips, then you now have an inside champion that will help you carry it home. It doesn't happen all the time. And I think with every business, I'm sure Cristián sees the same thing. You have probably 25% of your client load is going to be people who can see and are willing to look around the corner without knowing what's around the corner. They're the people you have to isolate on first.
That's fascinating, Bob. You're diving deep into the psychology, not only selling the idea, connecting with them as a human being and as a career person. That's fascinating. I haven't heard that angle before.
Yeah, not just the what's in it for me,
Yeah,
but also how does it help me as a person? Yeah.
It's a very holistic
solving
approach.
That's right. Like. Maybe shifting abruptly here, but going from the business to maybe a little bit of fun. Both of you guys live in very creative cities, a lot of creative stimuli going on in Madrid and Austin. Earlier, Cristián, you talked about learning from history and literature and museums and art. And what are some of the things, Cristián, that you get creative inspiration from and enjoy, just the fun side of creative thinking?
Actually, probably because I am an obsessed with my work, I would say that the other source is the rest of our team, because we have a very strange kind of professional team. We used to work in strategy issues, not only with the traditional approach of economists, engineers, and business administrators and MBAs and all that stuff, but we also work with musicians, with anthropologists, with psychologists and sociologists. So when you have that kind of team where you have different backgrounds and different life experiences in the same table, actually, on one hand, you achieve beautiful results. On the other hand, you have a lot of fun, because the creativeness, you can see that the creativeness is emerging from different sources, and it's beautiful to see how it flows.
That's great. Bob, where do you get your inspiration?
Just like Christian's obsessed with the work. I spend most of my time mentoring and trying to help other startups and other concepts come to life. And Austin obviously is a city that has startups on every corner. And there's a lot of deal flow going on and a lot of new ideas trying to be born and come to life. So I try to focus on the areas I know, healthcare and marketing, and in specific, healthcare is complex in the US, so it takes a while to really get good at it. And try to find those types of startups where you have passionate people who are willing to do what it takes to win, but are really trying to figure out their way. And my goal is always with them is to try to shorten the pathway, because I think a lot of good ideas die because they take too long. And as Mark knows, I'm a speed junkie in terms of I believe that speed reduces risk at every single level. And so if you can find a startup and you can give them the shortcuts, they require less money, they get traction faster, and the likelihood that the idea lives into full-blown adulthood is significantly stronger. So that's what I spend my time with. And by doing that, we end up having a little bit of ownership in a bunch of different companies, staying connected to them, paying attention to them, and trying to feed that ecosystem. So when I'm having conversations with others, I'm always trying to figure out how I can put that ecosystem to work and how I can help somebody inside of that ecosystem. So there's always ideas, and that's one of the problems with it is when you do that, it comes to the other side of this conversation, which is you literally see too many ideas. And for me, I have to really start to filter out the process, because I start to see so much that it really makes it easier. Like creating ideas and coming up with new ideas to start new things or do new things is not really an issue. It's controlling and saying, okay, I only have this much time. What am I going to do with that time? So I think for anybody who's listening that wants to who can't think of an idea or is really struggling to just figure out creatively which direction they want to go, if you immerse yourself in enough of it, it becomes the norm, right? It's another psychological trick. It's just a shift. The shift comes from the predictable to the creative is just by immersion, where your brain starts to get retrained as this is normal. And once doing stuff that's crazy every day that doesn't seem normal gets to be normal, then all of a sudden coming up with ideas is not that hard.
But like you say, filtering it.
Yeah.
And sometimes, how do I turn it off?
Yeah, I asked that question.
That's right. I've been asked that a lot. I drive down the street with my wife, who you guys know, but it's, oh my God, turn it off.
Yeah. And I guess that
But thinking also then to our theme of a world of creativity, I'm curious how you guys see cultural, global similarities or differences. You're working across borders. You're certainly worldly in your scope. Is the world becoming smaller, or are there still, whether it be culture or whether it just be traditional thinking, how do different countries, how do different markets maybe approach creativity? What's been your experiences?
I just think the internet changed everything. I think creativity was probably stifled by knowledge spread, and knowledge spread has become the currency of the world right now. So the ability for anybody at any place to get access, and not anybody's an overstatement, but a willing party in a reasonable country can literally get access to all the information that's needed to be creative, understand a process, and figure something out. So that's to democratize the whole knowledge spread. And by doing that, there's different viewpoints. And I spend a fair amount of time in Central America. And what you're seeing now is where countries like that would really normally adopt from the US or Europe, they're now creating a lot of their own products. And I go down and I see not their own sort of physical brands because they don't have the manufacturing capability, but they're starting to create their own service brands, and they're starting to produce products and services that actually originate from there. And you'll even see it with some of the agricultural products that come out of those countries. Instead of, just a poor example, but instead of it just being pineapple juice, they're starting to build a story and a brand behind that pineapple juice, and they're starting to sell it at least a regional market versus where it was just very much inward looking before. So I think it's coming along. I think you're starting to see it spread faster, and it's accelerating. And I think the gap between places that are set up and wired for technology and wired for innovation, like the US and Europe, and the gap between those places and the rest of the world is closing quickly.
Cristián, you're working in Central and South America as well. How are you seeing differences in the approach to creative thinking?
Yeah, first, I agree with Bob. Right now, there are certain changes happening due to internet and the access to knowledge. There is a huge democratization of knowledge. However, culturally, I see certain differences. For example, if you go to Central America, they are very creative, but they go a little slower than the rest of the world because they do not have the need. If you go to the south, if you go to Argentina, which is almost in crisis country, people is so creative because they need to survive to what is going on. So they have to be extremely creative, and their minds run in a high speed. If you come to Europe and see the south of Europe is very creative, but not too much, I would say, business oriented. So you have a huge amount of creativity, but in certain cases without a huge intention. If you go, for example, to Germany, you are going to discover that they are very creative, but after the creativity comes, they put the creativity in strong and very mechanical process, and they spend a lot of time with that. As an example of that, I remember in 1995, I was talking with some people working in Mercedes-Benz, and in 1995 they were developed a nitrogen engine with nitrogen fuel cells, and they continue developing that. But the reality is that Toyota already developed that kind of solutions. There are different solutions in the middle, and they spend a lot of time because they continue following a process which actually kill their creativity. There are certain differences there. And if you go, I don't know, to Asia Pacific, that they are very creative, but they used to base their creativity in their own legacy. So there are cultural things that change the way they are understanding their creativity and the way they innovate.
That's very good insight.
Yeah.
What a terrific conversation. And I just want to thank you guys. As we close, I'm curious if people say, hey, I'm looking for some new inspiration. I'm looking for a new book to read. I'm looking for a new podcast besides A World of Creativity. It's a fantastic series. But is there a book, maybe a hidden gem, something that's not on the bestseller list? What book, Cristián, that you might recommend to folks?
I would say I was reading a book, the name is On Purpose. It's Sean Smith and Andy Milligan. All those that they are talking about purpose, the kind of examples that they are giving are very creative solutions to deal with things like purpose and new kind of business and approach to the business arena.
Fantastic. Bob?
More about a podcast that I listen to all the time.
Great.
It's a little, yeah. He's a guy that's based out of Austin. His name is Noah Kagan, Kagan. He is the CEO of Sumo. So AppSumo, if you've ever bought apps at a discount online, he created that. He also runs King Sumo and this whole Sumo brands plus SendFox. And his whole model is based around creating products for small businesses to be economical, get high visibility, and do those types of applications or software systems that allow businesses to scale quickly. The interesting part with him is, A, he's a little crazy. He's really funny.
I'm seeing a theme here on creativity. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things he does in his podcast is he talks to people who use his products, and his products are pretty widely used, but he talks to small companies that use his products, companies usually between $1 million and $10 million. And they give intimate details about their businesses, where they're at, where they're stuck at, why they can't get it to go, what their issues are. And he spends an hour with these companies and goes through a whole autopsy of what their issues are. And then between Noah Kagan himself from seeing all these other businesses and then some of the readers or some of the people who listen, there's a community idea build of how to help that person. And then they come back 3 to 6 months later, and then they talk about the top 3 or 4 ideas that were developed out of that conversation and how it worked and what was the financial impact on the business, how did the business grow with it, and so forth. So it's interesting. I enjoy listening to it because there's a lot more a business where somebody does museums. They do museum tours. You wouldn't think would be all that exciting, but there's a whole lot of stuff underneath these businesses that is really creative, is a really interesting way to get an idea how to apply something to your own situation. And then to see input from everyone else on the fly and have that generate into something else that actually helps somebody move their business along it's a pretty interesting concept. And he's not dealing with big corporate Fortune 500s. He's dealing with people who have really risen out of their garages and turned a business. So it's a compelling. He does some other stuff in the podcast as well to keep it interesting, but it's really compelling when he does these business autopsies or dissections. I call it a dissection since they're still alive. So
that's awesome. I'm familiar with him, Bob, and he's a wealth of knowledge, isn't he?
He is. It's interesting because I think there's a core group in Austin here that runs a ton of e-commerce that got started early, and they've done millions and millions of dollars worth of sales through all of where they've been involved in. And because of that, they just see everything. And because they have that oversight, they have the ability to pick what they see what works before everybody else sees it, or it becomes self-evident.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Gentlemen, Mark and I want to thank you for joining us. This has been very enlightening and insightful. We really do appreciate you spending time with us today.
Great. No problem.
Great. Thank you very much. And forgive me because my English sounded a little strange.
You're fine.
Your creativity is what we were interested in.
Yeah.
You speak better English than me. Don't worry.
No. I'm sure I'm not.
Okay. Thank you guys again. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wow, what a great episode. Two gentlemen who are just got their finger on the pulse of creativity.
Yeah,
Thanks for
and you
setting
can
this
tell
up,
that
Mark.
there's just no shortage for them. I liked how they talk about the more you create, the more you can create. You do build that creative muscle, which I always thought you could. When many people
Yeah, I've
say
heard
you
for-
can, but it's really interesting how they were talking about the tools that they use. One of my takeaways from the interview, if I could just summarize, would be that these gentlemen would espouse that you're creating towards something, that there's a tension, as Cristián called it, impression, as Bob termed it, that something needs to be solved. And so their creative process, their creative thinking is not only inspired by that problem, but really focused on solving that problem. And so they each had a model, a 3x3 grid, or in Cristián's case, this ABCDE, that was a go-to method. And again, I think when we think about creative people, sometimes we think it just comes out of the air. We always have this light bulb icon that goes with creativity. But there was a tool and a method that says, I'm going to put the problem at the top of the page. Then I'm going to put some possible solutions. Then I'm going to put the design ideas or design thinking, and then how we're going to execute it and whether that will work or not, and combine some ideas, and then we'll see what happens. I thought that was
an awesome tool.
the focus on the problem and the use of a tool. I found very useful.
Yeah, I did too. And I hadn't heard of that type of system before, but I'm definitely going to integrate that with my own work too, because it's just, I think we need those systems to contain the ideas. Otherwise they just fill up a container with a bunch
Sure.
of stuff. There's no order in there. And I like
There's
that.
stars in the skies, and there's leaves on the trees,
Yeah.
and there's clouds in the air, and there's ideas.
There's ideas.
That's okay. They're just bouncing around in your
But
head.
there's no place for them.
What
How
about-
he said we've got, what did he use? Feasible ideas or wrong ideas or good ideas, and he would categorize them in that sense, just so
Yes.
he gets a sense of it.
Yes. I think the second part was, and I felt I might have biased the question, even call it selling your ideas. But you have these ideas and you want to get sponsors, you want to get clients, you want people to help fund the idea. And I know I was guilty of this when I was coming up as a young creative and a writer and creative director at ad agencies, that you couldn't believe people couldn't appreciate your idea
Yeah.
instantly. Like,
The
it's so
brilliance of it,
genius. And I think that the way Cristián said, look, you have to know the person you're talking to. If they're a deductive mindset, then you build the story in the beginning, and then this happened, and then there was this conflict, and then we came up with this idea, and here's how it could work. Or if they're an inductive thinker, here's the idea, and here's the 7 ways that we think.
fascinating, yeah.
I think we as creative people, we're going to come up with ideas, we're going to build our creative muscle, but we can be wiser and also use tools and methods to inspire people to see the creative behind the idea.
Yeah,
And,
definitely.
I thought I got a lot out of that discussion.
I did too. And both of them spoke to that too, how they approach with different types of clients and how they sell that idea. Bob talked about, and I found this fascinating, how he talked about whether the person is looking at their career and looking at them as a person, helping them succeed, not only their company because they're a part of the company, but I thought that was a little broader perspective, a little more holistic approach.
Yes.
Really interesting, really fascinating.
Yeah. And I think then the last point I would make is, and Bob kicked off this idea and Cristián built on it, that if you have the customer in mind, the person, and really personalize your creative thinking, wow. And I think that as well, vision boards, and if you can envision your idea and really get a clear picture of your creative inspiration, but to have the user or the customer or a patient in his case for his business, but if you really say, I'm working for a person rather than just I'm trying to come up with an idea.
Yeah. It makes it much more tangible, and it obviously is working for him, and it makes gets a better product, get to the heart of it faster.
Yeah, definitely.
Great.
2 great individuals today, 2 sides of the world, and Austin and Madrid being creative cities. They're obviously getting a lot of creative inspiration. And we've got more great
we've got more
interviews
in
to
the
come.
hopper.
Later, we're going to be talking with a creative individual who's really networking and connecting women and business entrepreneurs in Paris, and a researcher, a market analyst, a PhD in New Delhi, India.
Great.
We're going to be talking with a creative guy in Columbus, Ohio, as well as a sort of sales professional and, again, very creative individual out of Germany. And lots of ideas from there.
Definitely. So look for those coming down the line here on A World of Creativity podcast. I'm Mark Phillips.
And I'm Mark Stinson. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. All the best.
Unlocking Your World of Creativity with best-selling author and brand innovator Mark Stinson. This program was produced by BSB Media, creators of IntelliKey Leadership Stories, Unlocking Your World of Creativity, and thepeaceroom.love. If you like this podcast, here's another show that you'll like from BSB Media. The Patients Speak. Healthcare Innovations Accelerating the Patient Journey. It features interviews with healthcare leaders, patient advocates, medical providers, and researchers. Presented by 83 Bar. Look for The Patients Speak on your favorite podcast app.